Hi, my name is Eric, and these handmade models are based on my original concepts for droids, creatures, and characters that inhabit the world of Aegis, a planet grappling with a mysterious fungal infection. Today we're traveling from the dunes of Pulsera to the territory of Ekra, a dynasty in control of hundreds of small islands. I'll walk you through my creative process of conceptualizing this model all the way through the building and painting stages, and we'll finish up with a short story explaining the lore behind the build. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. Most of my models start with a visual, a rough mental image that comes gradually into focus, blooming into details, textures, colors, and eventually a story. But sometimes it's the other way around, and the story is the seed that germinates into a scene, and this was one of those times. But to tell this particular story, I needed a small transport vehicle hanging from a suspended track, and I had just the piece to get me started. This truck cabin from the Transformers toy I dissected for the last build. But for this concept art piece, I wanted to attempt something that is an absolute weakness of mine: two-point perspective drawing. You may have noticed that I tend to draw my concept pieces from the side or head-on. This is fairly easy to do, but the result is flat. To really get a grasp for the way a 3D object inhabits a space, I needed to push my boundaries. I struggled with this. Drawing from this angle forced me to figure out what kind of details would be seen in all the nooks and crannies, areas that are usually not visible on profile. Of course, the benefit of this is that when it comes time to build, I'll know what pieces to look for to fill out these spaces. It took a while, but I found that it did get a little easier as I went, and eventually I was left with this. Repeating my process for the last build, I outlined everything in pen using a Tombow brand brush pen for the thicker outlines and STA felt tips for the finer line work. Once again, I found this process incredibly helpful, as it forced me to think through the build process before ever pulling out the plastic and superglue. For coloring, I'm using these Shernan Professional watercolors. You can find a link to these supplies and most others seen in this video by clicking on the video description below. If you end up purchasing any supplies, Amazon throws a few pennies my way, and you won't pay anything extra, making it a pretty neat way to help support this channel. I began construction by first snapping some images of the toy truck, cutting out the background, then importing the resulting PNG into Adobe Animate, where I do most of my template design. The great thing about this method is that not only does it guarantee a snug fit after cutting, but it also helps me better envision the final profile of the vehicle. Of course, for any of this to work, it's essential that the paper template prints to the exact dimensions needed, so I added this measurement key, then double-checked it after printing. Once sure I was on track, I got to cutting and snapping this 2mm styrene. For the angled side skirts, I snapped the scoring line I'd carved into the styrene without completely breaking it, then got to work on all the paneling and detailing, which was done in 1mm styrene. Off camera, I did some more template design for the cargo area of the truck, then cut out the pieces and began assembling it all, section by section. By the way, the reason I'm switching between plastic weld and superglue for these joints is this. Plastic weld is great for broad, flat areas where there's lots of surface contact. It also dries with almost no residual texture, making it great for more noticeable areas. I found that superglue, on the other hand, is much faster acting, making it good for gluing edges, especially in places less noticeable. With the basic truck shape complete, it was now on to the fun stuff. Or so I thought. In actuality, designing this hinged arm for the transport side skirts was a major headache. Though it looked great on my screen, it printed out about as thin as an eggshell, and cracked about as easily as one too. So it was back to Blender, where I beefed everything up, printed again, glued it all together, and was feeling pretty good. Like nothing bad could ever happen again to these hinges. Foreshadowing. With the hinges definitely not about to cause me any more headaches, I decided to focus on the rest of the detailing, like the innards of this tea light for the back panel. And if these bar frames look familiar, good job. You were paying attention in my little flea video, where I made a slightly larger set for the mech's legs. These were my original misprints, and the reason why I never throw anything away. It was now time to work on this area here, which took up just a square inch of paper real estate, but suggested a labyrinth of pipes under here. This motorcycle toy was perfect for this. I just needed to bifurcate it with my Dremel to get two matching pipes, and for the love of all that is holy, do not ever do this. It's a little hard to tell from the footage, but this blade is spinning in the direction of my finger, and I'm not using gloves, and this would have been a trip to the ER had this been an actual saw blade and not just a metal sanding disc. With the pipes and some wires added, I was excited to try the newest material in my supply kit, these silicone tubes of various diameters. These are definitely a superior option to the sculpted tubes I did in the last build, and because they're hollow, they can actually attach to rods and pins, making for some pretty realistic effects. I then detailed the undercarriage since it felt a little bare, but this was an exceptionally dumb move as it made gluing the side skirt arm hinges here impossible. Oh, but that's not even the worst of it. So I don't exactly know how this happened, whether I accidentally bumped the side skirts or something fell on the table while I wasn't around, but I came back to my bench the next day to find this. I decided at this point to switch gears entirely, moving on to the tram's roof-mounted engine. One nice thing about these projects that I'm grateful for is that there's always something to work on, so when I feel myself hitting a wall or getting frustrated with one aspect, I take a break to fiddle on something else. Above all else, it's crucial to keep the momentum going on these projects, to always be working on something each day, even if only for a few minutes. Although the engine was 3D printed, I added plenty of details to flesh out the design, like the sleeves of this electrical wire. And to make lemonades from lemon, I was able to turn one of these broken side skirt arms into this little engine-mounted thing. But before attaching the engine to the tram, I needed to finish up with the other tram faces, adding this 3D printed grille. But don't even get me started on these slatted windows. I lost count of how many times I had to design and reprint these, as they were again very thin and brittle, and clearly I don't learn from my mistakes. Finally, the engine was glued on, and my side skirt arms, which after 4 attempts were finally strong enough. And then the side skirts for the top. The bottom skirts fold out, in theory, to become steps for the passengers entering and exiting the tram, while the top skirts fold down for extra protection against sudden storms at sea. It was next onto the tram pylons, and for these I wanted something that felt old, skeletal, and battered by the elements. I came up with a simple template, being sure to split the angles of each bend exactly in half so that the 2 faces would match. This was something I learned from working with dowels on an earlier project. If the angles of the 2 items with identical diameters varies, the faces won't match up, so it's essential to bisect angles exactly in half. I thought this idea of putting the template under an acrylic sheet and then cutting the rods on top of it was a good one, but it would have been much smarter to use the saw and exact measurements, a lesson I didn't learn until this was all over. Although, you can't shoot field goals with a miter saw, so that was fun. To glue these all together, I first laid down a sheet of parchment paper, then carefully fit all of the cut pieces together to match the template below and attached with plastic weld. Once that had hardened, I added the cross beams, and once everything had dried, I scraped them off and had 4 pylon sides. I did do a bit of gap filling here with superglue and baking soda, which also helped to further strengthen these frames. I then sanded it all down for a smooth finish. Then came more cross beams before the pylon sandwiches were assembled. These pedestals of XPS foam made for the concrete pylon bases, though I really wish I'd used the wire cutter rod for this rather than a drill, which was extremely imprecise. Everything was then put together with hot glue and toothpicks. I later came back with Milliput to fill in some of these gaps, then textured everything with this wire brush to give it a nice, porous, weathered concrete look. Then came yet another template to make these styrene panels, to give the pylons more visual interest and strength. I wizened up just a bit for the pylon arms here, opting this time to use my miter saw to cut the styrene rods, which made for much cleaner angles. And once this was all put together in the same way I did the pylons, it was time to attach everything. The last step of these pylons was to make some electrical cables that would power the tram, which were made from string, aluminum wire, electrical wire, and one of those silicone tubes. It was all heat shrinked together, then, with some difficulty, installed into the pylons. With that section done, I cut a base out of this XPS foam, then mounted and glued everything together, and was feeling pretty excited, because now it was on to the sculpting, painting, and assembling, and more importantly, for the short story.
You're watching Gaming Builds. Thank you.
The passenger counted pylons as they whirred past the gem-studded windows of his first-class cabin. He savored the feel of the fine embroidered tablecloth before raising a finger, first to signal to the attendant to shut off an annoying news station squawking from the hanging console, and second, to order a glass of sparkling orange liqueur, a vintage, nearly impossible to get now. But if ever there was a day worth celebrating, it was today. Mig Poyle was ascending, not just to the physical peak of the tram rail, where he would climb the hills into the capital, but more notably to the peak of his career, the apex of his very life. At a mere 28 years old, he was being summoned by General Sina, the head advisor to the king of the Ekra Dominion. Not that Mig was surprised. He was born for greatness. The royal family was simply late in acknowledging it. The House of Ekra had ruled this region for 4 centuries, with a discretion and cunning so sharp that they had little need for daggers. While the other royal houses squandered resources mustering mechanical armies, the Ekrites could will theirs into existence by the sheer force of their reputation. So great was their fame that it was a difficult thing, drawing the line between myth and matter. Mig had studied mathematics at the Ekra University, had excelled, had outgrown his teachers, had learned all there was to know of numbers and theorems, and thus had sought out a topic vastly more interesting: predictive models. So began his foray into societal theory, macropsychology, and correlative probability. Now, instead of solving rudimentary and abstract equations, he was working out behavioral predictions of island tribes and mapping out a century of psychological decay in successive generations stranded aboard a malfunctioning space freighter. But it did not take Mig long to realize that he was as much the student here as he was the subject, that these so-called hypothetical scenarios had real-world correlations, and that his answers were being carefully weighed and scrutinized in a kind of screening process. He was being groomed for greatness, unsurprisingly. When 2 expressionless men in sharp burgundy uniforms appeared one day, Mig could predict their questions before they were uttered, and he accepted their offer before it was extended. Yes, of course he was interested in joining the Ideators, Ekra's elite think tank, and a mere step away from the advisors to the king. The only thing that surprised Mig Poyle was that it had taken them so long to ask. The project to which he was assigned was a sensitive one that could never be discussed beyond the walls of his new quarters. To put it simply, the Ekra Dominion had a prison problem. There were too many prisoners and not enough colonies to contain them. The Dominion had always struggled with its unwieldy swath of territory, straddling 1,000 islands and a stretch of the northern continent above the great Aegean Sea. But with the Blight, the ground had been seeded not only with spores, but with unrest and poverty, and that ever-predictable byproduct, crime, had flourished alongside the fungi, feasting on the rotting remains of civilization. Many islands had hastily been converted into prison colonies, but it still wasn't enough. The prisoners could not simply be executed. Too many of them were serving minimal sentences for minor infractions, nor could they be released early, a dangerous precedent that would surely undermine the regime's power. A more creative solution was required. Mig Poyle poured himself into his work. For 2 months he ate little and slept less, absorbing all he could about the prison systems, the suspended tram rails linking them, the daily caloric intake of an average inmate, weather patterns around the islands, on and on and on. No detail too obscure, no nuance dismissed. And then, all at once, a solution presented itself. Mig Poyle had written up the proposal in a whirlwind binge of inspiration that lasted nearly 2 days, and then submitted it before sleeping the sweetest sleep he'd ever enjoyed. A long year had passed, and now the summons. General Sina had requested his immediate presence, So Mig had gotten dressed in his finest garb, had booked a seat on the most expensive rail, and had made his way to the capital. This was it, Mig knew, an official invitation to join the royal advisors.
"We implemented your proposal," said the general,
his voice echoing through the grand royal chambers. But Mig felt no apprehension or intimidation. This was his place. No surprises. "Then I expect your problem has been solved," Mig responded, tugging on the tails of his coat jacket to straighten out the wrinkles.
"In fact, it has," said the general.
Finally, thought Mig. Finally they realized my potential. "I trust that the other ideators did not produce such results," said Mig. And who could have? The plan had been a stroke of sheer genius.
"Your solution was a clever one," admitted the general. "No one else had considered turning to prison labor for the tram rail maintenance. Concerns of sabotage, you see."
Nor then could anyone concoct a scheme to set up conditions in such a way that fatal accidents would be common, yet the salaries so enticingly high that convicts would willingly take the risks, said Mig proudly, sensing growing admiration from his listener.
"Yes," the general agreed. "And the contractual stipulation that any unpaid salary for a deceased worker would return to the Ekra Foundation was a brilliant move."
Mig smiled, already anticipating the sweet life of luxury awaiting him at the capital.
"Of course," continued the general, "there is the matter with the Karra-Sabbat."
"The sea-eater?" Mig asked, his expression shifting. He'd read all there was to read on the subject of the giant squid, but failed to appreciate the correlation.
"The Karra-Sabbat, as you must know, are omnivorous. They are opportunistic feeders. Kelp, krill, fish, even other squid, if injured."
"Ah, they're consuming the fallen prisoners," Mig said, at once putting it together. He shrugged. "Fine. Were it not for them, it'd be some other sea creature, the cycle of life and all that." The general's gaze narrowed, a shadow falling over his features.
"The Karra-Sabbat are too lazy to hunt, but they are not stupid. There is no doubt that the squid have learned that the trams are the carriers of this new food source. They've begun congregating below the tram rails, waiting for falling scraps."
Mig said nothing. A fuzzy picture was beginning to form in his mind, and though he couldn't discern the details, he did not like the way it churned the contents of his stomach. Suddenly, the general raised a hand and snapped his fingers, and immediately a chrome-plated drone whirred into sight and began projecting a moving image on the wall. It was a news story. The date was that very morning. 2 Karra-Sabbat had cooperated to bring down a tram pylon, plunging a passenger car into the sea. It was no ordinary car. A royal child had been on board. I couldn't have known," Mig attempted, his mouth unbearably dry, his coat stiflingly hot. The general only shook his head.
"It was your job to know, Mr. Poyle."
And as the armed guards emerged from the shadows and escorted Mig to a tram very different from the one he'd arrived on, for a destination he was exceedingly familiar with, he felt only one emotion: surprise. Thank you all so much for watching, especially my lovely patrons. If you'd like to join them for access to all my original Blender models, audio recordings, and the full text of my short stories and more, follow the Patreon link at the end. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds. Over and out.